On the morning of September 16th, 1919, Adolf Hitler was nobody. He was 30 years old. He had accomplished nothing notable in his life up to that point. In fact, he was downwardly mobile, a shiftless man living in hostels, constantly on the verge of homelessness. And then he attended a meeting of the little-known German Workers' Party. He was asked to do so by the German military to keep an eye on this new party and see what they were all about. There were only a handful of people there at the meeting. A couple of them got up and gave boring, forgettable speeches. Hitler was not impressed. Then one final speaker got up and began to speak on a subject that was near to Hitler's heart. The man was advocating that Bavaria, a region of southern Germany, separate from the rest of the German nation. Hitler was outraged. Above all, he believed in German unification. Hitler stood up and began to speak. Within a few minutes, Hitler had his small audience absolutely captivated. The passion and eloquence with which he spoke on the issue was unlike anything they had seen or heard before. He was so vociferous and so persuasive that the man with whom he disagreed fled from the room before the end of the speech. In his autobiography, Hitler wrote of this moment, quote, "What I had always felt and assumed to be true was now being proven. I could speak." Hitler lacked many of the attributes of a great man. He did not have tremendous energy or a strong work ethic. In fact, he was almost unbelievably lazy. He was intelligent, but not brilliant. He was not a good organizer or manager. But he could do this one thing. He could speak. And it tells you something about how important that one ability is, how every other ability pales in comparison, that he would ride that one talent to become the leader of one of the world's great nations, establish the first pan-European empire since Napoleon, and ultimately ignite the greatest and most destructive war in human history. With this one ability, he would convince cowards to march bravely into battle, and he would convince mild-mannered professionals to commit terrible atrocities. I wonder what it must have felt like after. This small group of people showed up to hear what you usually expect from such a political gathering. A boring speech from some professor about who knows what. The strongest reaction they probably expected to have was to nod in solemn agreement. And then, one of the greatest orators of all time is born before their eyes. And then it's over. That's it. You rub your eyes, you walk home. Did they suspect that in the most unlikely circumstances possible, in a dingy basement room of a small Munich beer hall, they had just witnessed the world change forever? Hello, and welcome to How to Take Over the World. This is Ben Wilson. On this episode, I want to explore how Hitler built a movement. And I know it might feel subversive and wrong to learn from Hitler, but obviously to learn from someone is not to endorse what they do. How to Take Over the World has never been just about learning from the approved list of good guys. And that's for a reason. I feel that if only bad people study how to take and use real power, then only bad people will hold power. I want people that I like, people I agree with, my people, to have power. And that means studying how to take power very deeply from every angle, including from people like Hitler and Stalin and Putin and Trump or Obama, from every angle. And with Hitler, with a story that ends so disastrously, of course, there are lots of what you might call anti-lessons, things not to do, things to look out for, of course. So yes, while we will be learning from Hitler, we are, of course, going to learn both what to do to build a movement, because obviously he did that quite successfully, but we're also going to be learning what not to do and what to look out for. And I do want to stress that this series is going to be a straightforward, objective look at the life and times of Adolf Hitler. What made him who he became, what made him tick, how he built a movement, how he took power, how he wielded it, what we can learn from that. And obviously, it's something that's hard for many people to look at from that objective standpoint because of all the things he did. You know, he affects everyone's lives. There are people who will be watching, listening to this, whose grandparents probably died in the Holocaust, right? Myself, you know, my life has been affected. Both of my grandfathers fought in World War II for the Americans. So it does, like his influence still touches the modern day. So I know that To say that we're going to take an objective look, that's not something that everyone can do. But I do think it is important to do sometimes, to take ourselves out of the moment and just say, all right, just from an objective standpoint, what happened here, and what can we take from it, so that we can take those lessons and apply them for good causes. Before we get started, a special thank you to Dr. Richard Johnson, who graciously agreed to sponsor this episode, and a couple of others. He's got nothing to advertise. He's just a fan who reached out and wanted to help create something wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your generous patronage. So let's get into it. Sources are in the show notes if you're interested. This is part 1 on the life of Adolf Hitler. Before we get into this week's episode, I want to tell you about the Classical Society. This is a society for successful professionals who are interested in helping one another and advancing classical ideas of excellence, virtue, and beauty. We study the classical art of rhetoric together and help one another in our pursuits, whether that is business, politics, or culture. We just finished our first retreat in Austin, Texas, and it was incredible. It is a great group of guys. We've got a retreat this fall in Sicily, and we got a couple other in the US later this year. If that sounds interesting to you, if you're the type of person who has been successful in business, could spend a few $1,000s a year on something like this, and also is interested in the classical tradition in Western civilization, then you can find out more at theclassicalsociety.com. I hope you'll check it out. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889 in a town called Braunau am Inn, which is in Austria, but just across the border from Germany. Hitler was born a citizen of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the Habsburg dynasty sitting on the throne. This will be important later because he feels like a German, but he's separated from the actual country of Germany by an arbitrary political border. Okay, so what can we say about Hitler's early life? Does it explain who he became? Was there some deep evil latent within the child Adolf Hitler? On the one hand, I would say he did have a relatively normal middle-class upbringing in Austria. And on the other hand, I think there are some things that we can point to, some attributes that made Hitler distinctive that are present from a very young age. So to start off with, his father, Alois Schicklgruber, came from a poor background but climbed the ranks of the Austrian finance ministry, becoming a customs inspector by 1875. So he was responsible for checking goods moving between Austria and Germany. In 1876, about a decade before Adolf's birth, Alois changed his last name from Schicklgruber to Hitler. The reason why he might have done this are complicated. Basically, he was not raised by his biological father. Actually, we're not even sure who his biological father was. And he was his adoptive father's only son. So this adoptive father wanted to be able to have the legacy of his family carry on. And so Alois Schicklgruber changes it to Hitler. The name is actually a pretty common name. The name comes from the word hut. Okay, so a Hitler is literally someone who lives in a hut. But it was actually usually rendered as either Hutler or Heidler. So Hitler was an intentionally distinctive variation on a common name. So I think, like his famous son, Alois had a flair for standing out from the crowd. I think he was drawn to adopting Hitler rather than Heidler Hutler because he knew it makes me slightly different and people notice. As many historians have pointed out, this was something of a lucky break for Adolf Hitler, because it's difficult to envision people standing in the street shouting, Heil Schicklgruber, right? It's just kind of a mouthful. And Hitler is, I don't know, kind of good branding. Like I said, it's normal, it's very German sounding, but at the same time, it's a little bit distinctive. And there aren't many other Hitlers in Germany or Austria at the time. Alois, so that's Hitler's father, was an interesting man. Here's what Hitler biographer Ian Kershaw writes about him. Quote, Alois was an archetypal provincial civil servant. Pompous, status-proud, strict, humorless, frugal, pedantically punctual, and devoted to duty. He was regarded with respect by the local community, but both at work and at home, he had a bad temper which could flare up quite unpredictably. He smoked like a chimney and enjoyed a few drinks after work and a discussion around the beer table more than going back home. Alois was a typical authoritative, I guess you could say authoritarian Austrian father. He did hit his children, especially Adolf. The Hitler younger sister Paula would later write, quote, if there were ever quarrels of differences of opinions between my parents, it was always on account of the children. It was especially my brother Adolf who challenged my father to extreme harshness and who got his sound thrashing every day. How often, on the other hand, did my mother caress him and try to obtain with her kindness what the father could not succeed in obtaining with harshness. So this was Hitler's upbringing, a stern and demanding father and a loving and doting mother. It's worth noting that while Alois was frequently abusive, this doesn't appear to have been life-threatening or really anything outside the norm for the time and place. No one outside of the family commented on, oh, Hitler's showing up to school with bruises on his face or anything like that. No, he did hit Hitler, but those were kind of the times. In the first decade of the 1900s, it was pretty common for a rural Austrian father to physically discipline his children. One does get the impression that Alois was a little more harsh and strict than most fathers at the time, but not way outside the mainstream. Alois, having this controlling father certainly did leave a mark on Hitler's psyche. I do think that's true, but this alone is not enough to explain why Hitler became the person that he did. They frequently moved houses due to Alois' hobbies and flights of fancy. He was a very serious amateur beekeeper, and they often moved so that he could have a better place to raise bees. Hitler actually had an older half-brother, Alois Jr., but he basically ran away from home at a young age, and so that meant all of Clara and Alois' hopes and dreams went into Adolf. Alois really hoped that young Adolf would take after him and become a government minister, a government employee. But in his autobiography, Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler would write, quote, "I yawned and grew sick to my stomach at the thought of sitting in an office deprived of my liberty, ceasing to be master of my own time." So what did he want to do, if not become a government minister like his father? One neighbor from the time later reported, quote, "When the postmaster asked him one day what he wanted to do for a living and whether he wouldn't like to join the post office, he replied that it was his intention to become a great artist." And I think that is very telling of Hitler's personality. He doesn't say he wants to become an artist. He wants to become a great artist. He is audacious. He is ambitious. He is independent. It doesn't matter if his father is telling him that it's stupid and that he should be serious and practical. He wants to be a great painter, a great artist. And that is basically his home life. What can we learn from Hitler at school? Well, that gave us the key to unlocking his personality. In school, Hitler was intelligent and lazy. Socially, he was something of a small ringleader and troublemaker. Like his father, he was noted for his obstinance and short temper. There is a photograph of Hitler as a boy where this element of his personality really stands out. I think this photograph, and I'll show it if you're watching on Spotify or YouTube, this photograph is interesting because the haughtiness just stands out so much. He's so defiant. You can see the domineering personality of Hitler right here from a very young age. Despite his occasional antics, Hitler performed well in elementary school. However, after moving to a technical secondary school, he struggled academically and repeated a year after failing mathematics and French. His teachers consistently described him as smart, but unwilling to apply his talents to anything useful. People have been trying to explain this notable failure in school ever since. People have all sorts of theories and explanations. That he was ADD, that his deteriorating home life, his abusive father was the cause of it, that it was the fact that they were kept moving homes and this new environment was bad for him. Personally, I think it was some combination of him just naturally having a lazy disposition and not really caring about school once he had decided that he wanted to become a great artist. Here's how Hitler explains away his bad grades. In a scene out of a movie, he tells his father, "I want to be an artist, Dad." And reading now from Mein Kampf, quote, "The result was not pleasant. The old gentleman was embittered, and though I loved him, I was equally bitter. My father forbade me even to hope that I would study painting. I went a step further and declared that in that case, I would not learn anything more. Of course, I came in second with such a declaration since the old gentleman began to ruthlessly assert his authority. I then learned to keep silent in the future, but I did carry out my threat. I hoped that when my father saw my lack of progress in school, he would have to let me pursue the happiness I dreamed of." Okay, so to hear Hitler tell it, he's intentionally sandbagging school in the hopes of convincing his father to let him drop out and study painting full-time. But he wouldn't have to deal with that conflict for much longer. On January 3rd, 1903, Alois Hitler stopped at a local inn for a morning glass of wine. He complained that he felt unwell and shortly thereafter collapsed and died at his table. He was 65 years old. Adolf was 13 years old. After his father's death, Adolf drifted through school in Linz and Steyr, where he barely passed most subjects. At 16, in 1905, he fell ill with a lung infection, possibly serious, possibly not, but he used it as a reason to stop attending school, a decision that his mother, Clara, agreed to. From the age of 16 to 18, he lived in Linz in what was essentially a carefree, responsibility-free existence. He was supported financially by his mother and spent his days drawing, reading, and fantasizing about grand buildings and art. He frequently attended the theater and opera, avoiding any real form of work. He frequently went to the opera with a standing room only ticket because, with his father dead, They got a widow's pension, his mother did, so they had some money, but they definitely were not as wealthy as they once had been. So he's getting these standing room only tickets, cheapest way to get into the opera, and a lot of other young men would be there in the standing room only section. During one of his regular opera visits, Hitler was noticed by a young man who thought he saw in him the same intensity of feeling that he had for the opera. Here's what the young man, his name was August Kubizek, nicknamed Gussel, would later write about it. Quote, "We took note of each other without exchanging a word. During the interval of a performance, sometime later, we started talking, as apparently neither of us approved of the casting of one of the parts. We discussed it together and rejoiced in our common adverse criticism. I marveled at the quick, sure grasp of the other. In this, he was undoubtedly my superior. On the other hand, when it came to talking of purely musical matters, I felt my own superiority. I cannot give the exact date of this first meeting, but I am sure it was around All Saints' Day in 1904. This went on for some time, he revealing nothing of his own affairs, nor did I think it necessary to talk about myself. But all the more intensely did we occupy ourselves with whatever performance there happened to be, and sensed that we both had the same enthusiasm for the theater. Once, after the performance, I accompanied him home to number 31 Humboldtstrasse. When we took leave of each other, he gave me his name, Adolf Hitler." Okay, it's like kind of crazy to hear the story of this kid, right? And you can just, again, you can imagine the movie, like these two kids meeting and the one just going home. By the way, what's your name? Adolf Hitler. Whoa. Again, I think this is one of the first things to note about Hitler's personality. He genuinely had the temperament and disposition of an artist. That's not what most people think of when they think of Hitler. But he was obsessed with the opera. The only intense personal relationship of his childhood came with Kubizek, and it was formed over their common obsession with art. Kubizek later says that he was a good friend for Hitler because he was a good listener. Hitler frequently launched into long diatribes about all sorts of things, but his most common subjects were Wagner, art, the opera, and architecture. Okay, he was obsessed with especially the opera, but all forms of art. The two became such good friends that in 1907, they both moved to Vienna and became roommates. So, we're now moving into a different phase of Hitler's life. So to wrap up our takeaways from Hitler's life before Vienna, it's 1907, he's 18 years old. So from his childhood, he's intelligent but lazy. He's very headstrong and determined. He's intense, he's a prankster. He wants what he wants and he can't be moved from it. But still, he seems like a pretty normal person. The one thing that perhaps distinguishes him is his intensity of interest in the arts. He has an artist's soul. So that intense interest in the arts, I do think sets him apart from most normal people, but that's not completely abnormal, right? I think the first inkling that we get of the exceptional parts of Hitler's personality come from the early days in Vienna. He's living in a small rented room with Kubizek, and Kubizek goes on to remark that there was, quote, an incredible earnestness in him, a true passionate interest in everything that happened, and most important, an unfailing devotion to the grandeur of art. When a self-imposed task engrossed him completely and forced him to unceasing activity, it was as though a demon had taken possession of him. Oblivious to his surroundings, he never tired, he never slept, he ate nothing. Never before had I been so deeply impressed by this ecstatic creativeness. All right, so that's interesting. Hitler was generally a sort of lazy person, but when excited, he could work extremely intensely. So what is it he's working on with Kubizek? They're coming up with all these plans and schemes. They make castles in the sky. The one that they work longest and most seriously on is a traveling orchestra to bring the experience to the masses who live out in the countryside. So he and Kubizek throw themselves into the idea, drawing up plans and routes and renderings, coming up with an entire scheme of how this might be done. At one point, they come to a problem. The transportation methods that they have envisioned won't be able to fit 3 large double action harps, which is this really large instrument. And Kubizek says, well, what's the big deal? Let's make do with just 1 double action harp. And Hitler says, absolutely not. Quote, how can you play the fire music with only 1 double action harp in the orchestra? The magical fire music is an excerpt from a Wagner opera. And Kubizek responds, well then, the fire music won't be included in the repertoire. To which Hitler responds, you bet it will. All right, so this is the next great feature of Hitler's personality. An insistence on grandeur and a complete lack of consideration for normal proportions or limitations. Everything had to be the grandest, the greatest, the best. It's why, when he was younger, he didn't tell the postman he wanted to be an artist. He wanted to be a great artist. And look, it's one of those attributes that isn't necessarily bad. Steve Jobs was the same way. Everything was either the best or it totally sucked, to use the phrasing that Steve Jobs used. So this isn't necessarily a bad attribute. It's just one that tends toward extreme outcomes. But even from a young age, he had this tendency toward taking things toward their most extreme interpretation with no sense of scale or proportion. He always took it to the very furthest possible outcome. And by the way, if this is your first time listening to this is what I do. I compare the strategies and habits of the great leaders of history. I know how it sounds comparing Steve Jobs and Hitler, and there actually will be quite a bit more of that. Actually, of all the people we have talked about on this podcast, Steve Jobs is the one who reminds me most of Hitler, more so than Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Julius Caesar, just from a personality standpoint. That doesn't mean I think Steve Jobs was a Hitler-like figure or that I'm equating them in any way, or I think Steve Jobs was like evil, obviously. So, please don't be offended by my comparisons of these historical figures throughout this episode. Yeah, it's just, I'm going to compare him to other figures. That doesn't mean that I think those other figures are genocidal maniacs. Okay. So at the same time that he's coming up with these schemes with Kubizek, he's also preparing to take the admissions test to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. This is still his ultimate goal. Go to art school and become a great artist. The main assessment at the academy was 2 3-hour examinations, where basically he's given a prompt, something to paint, and he has to paint it. He makes it through the initial examination and into the second round of examinations. However, he does not pass these and is ultimately not accepted into the academy. I am not a good enough artist or art critic to assess Hitler's skill in art. He certainly, he could paint a little bit. He could definitely draw. As someone who's untrained, I look at his paintings and I think, okay, he definitely has some natural artistic talent, but beyond that, I can't say. One biographer says that his paintings from this era are generally of better quality than his paintings for the admissions exam, suggesting that perhaps he had a case of nerves during the examinations. So maybe he could have made it into the academy if he hadn't buckled under the pressure. Maybe. It's also possible that he was just painting on a deadline, which would, of course, have an impact on the quality of your painting as it does on everyone else who you're testing with. My guess is that Hitler probably did have enough talent to be a painter if he had truly applied himself in preparation for the academy. But being a lackluster student, he had not learned enough technique to be prepared to matriculate at what is one of the best art academies in the world at the time. And again, whether he had the talent to be a great painter, no one can say, because he didn't go down that avenue and he didn't really apply himself. In Mein Kampf, Hitler would write that the director of the academy told him that he didn't have the prerequisite training to enter the academy, but that his skills were more suited to architecture and he should consider applying to architecture school. Later, when Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, the architect Albert Speer, who worked with him, would remark, quote, "In conferring with me over plans, Hitler perpetually drew sketches of his own. They were casually tossed off but accurate in perspective. He drew outlines, cross-sections, and renderings to scale. An architect could not have done better." All right, so clearly he did keep with him some amount of talent going forward. Anyway, I think it's probably best to think of Hitler as a somewhat gifted artist with an artist's eye for beauty and a decent painter, but not the great artist that he had imagined himself becoming. The bad news doesn't end there. At the time, his mother had cancer, and she had a surgery. It at first appeared to be successful, but it turned out that it was not successful, and the cancer reached stage 4. Mere weeks after Hitler arrived home from his failed test, his mother died. Her attending physician noted that he had never seen someone so moved by a death. All right, never. I mean, imagine, this is a country doctor, right? This is someone who is seeing people die all the time. He's seen dozens of deaths, maybe hundreds. And Adolf Hitler was more broken up by his mother's death than anyone he's ever seen. He was absolutely shattered. I do think, this is again funny to say, but I do think he was a very sensitive young man. So what does Hitler do now? He's now sort of severed ties, not intentionally, to his hometown. And he's failed out of art school, so he's really unmoored. So what does he do with his life? Well, not much. He decides that he's going to take the admissions test to the Vienna Academy of Art a second time. In the meantime, he hangs out in Vienna, goes to the opera, takes in the architecture, talks with and comes up with more plans with Kubizek. He's living off an orphan's pension that he gets from the state because both his parents are dead. and another small pension he gets from the state because his father was a public servant, plus some money that he's able to finagle out of a rich aunt. So yeah, he's just coming up with all these ideas. Hitler is an ideas guy. He's not a practical person, right? After his failed admissions test to the academy, does he consider going to a lesser art school? Of course not. Everything has to be the biggest and the best. To Hitler, everything had to be extravagant. And honestly, it's like, if he can't be the best, if he can't be a great painter, then he's got this passive aggressive attitude of like, then I'm just going to drop out. I'm not going to do anything. So he just schemes and dreams of all these great things that he could do while making no practical preparations for the near future. He's still living with Kubizek, but Hitler eventually abruptly leaves and moves into a hostel. We don't know why exactly, but it seems most likely that Hitler had secretly taken the admissions test to the academy a second time and failed once again. And during the same period, Kubizek had passed his examination to become a musician. So, ashamed and short of money, Hitler left Gusel without any notice or forwarding address, and they never spoke again. As Hitler's funds dwindled, he gradually slipped into homelessness. He first lived in a rented room in a lodging house with Kubizek, surviving on bread, butter, pudding, oatmeal, and milk. So like, still living he's not living extravagantly, but that's a nice living. But over time, he moved into smaller and cheaper accommodations, sometimes sleeping in inexpensive cafes and other times outdoors, wearing lice-ridden clothes. All right. Eventually, he's staying at doss houses for the homeless and relies on food from nuns at local churches. So a doss house or a flop house is not something that we really have anymore, but back in the early 1900s, there were a lot of different types of shared accommodations for people of the same sex. You had hotels at the high end, and then you had various flavors of hostels below that, which ranged from quite nice and middle class all the way down to pretty rundown. And then below that were doss houses or flop houses, which would have a row of cots, kind of like a hostel, but think like even bigger rooms, like kind of a warehouse of people. And once again, these ranged from fairly decent, kind of livable, for the temporarily down and out, all the way down to what were basically homeless shelters. And so Hitler starts at the top end and then makes his way down. Basically, he ends up, basically homeless. It's not accurate to quite call him truly homeless, but he's like just a half step away from that. In Mein Kampf, Hitler later claimed that he supported himself through manual labor, including construction work. But this appears to have been an attempt to obscure what actually happened, because people don't like to hear that their leaders were at one time basically homeless, not doing anything to get out of it. However, he does eventually start to climb his way out. This happens when he meets a man in one of these hostels named Hanisch, who convinces him to ask for more money from his wealthy Aunt Johanna to buy a long coat and shoes so he can go out on the streets to begin to look respectable and paint and sell his paintings. So Hitler starts this little business with his partner where he paints small paintings and postcards, and Hanisch would help sell them with his dealers. He had this whole group of dealers who, interestingly, were mostly Jewish. So by becoming a small-time artist, Hitler is able to work his way back up from being nearly homeless to going back to the better appointed hostels with academics, clerks, and other small-time professionals. Hitler says that it was this period of hardship that helped develop the man he would become. Reading now from Mein Kampf, quote, "That period made me strong. I thank fate for snatching me from the emptiness of a comfortable life and for pulling this mama's boy out of the comfortable, cozy bed. I was reluctantly thrown into the world of misery and poverty, which introduced me to those I would later fight for." He was still lazy. Hanisch would ask him to do more paintings, but he would say that he couldn't do work based on demand. He had to be in the right mood. And Hanisch would always retort that the only thing that put him in the right mood was running out of money. But still, he's making enough to live kind of the way he wanted to live. And he had shown grit and resourcefulness in picking himself up from a bottom feeder existence and putting himself on his feet again. Okay, so he's worked his way back up to a lower middle class existence. But even that is like not quite right. It's not the right way to think about it, is Hitler is lower middle class. I mean, like from a monetary perspective, a financial perspective, yes, that is true. He is moderately poor. But Hitler doesn't think of it that way because Hitler is a bohemian. The dictionary definition of a bohemian is, quote, a person, often an artist, writer, or intellectual, who lives an unconventional, often nomadic or itinerant life, free from the constraints of conventional rules. Bohemians reject materialism, prioritize creative pursuits, and often live in close-knit, informal communities. And that describes Hitler perfectly. He's not trying to advance in the world. He's happy with this free, unencumbered, artistic life. But the definition says that Bohemians use this freedom for an artistic pursuit. And what is Hitler's artistic pursuit? Because frankly, like, his paintings are just to make a couple bucks. It's not like a great artistic pursuit in his life. And the answer is, what he mostly wants this freedom for is to read. He is reading everything he can get his hands on. He reads books, lots and lots of books, as well as various political newspapers. These men's hostels contain a lot of other bohemians, and so it's very common for the library work area of the hostel to have a constant political discussion going on. According to those who lived in the same hostel as Hitler at the time, he customarily sat in the same seat every day, and he would sketch and draw or read, but he would mostly keep to himself. But as soon as he heard an error or something he disagreed with, he would suddenly speak out very aggressively and passionately. So from a young age, he has a very, very strong political viewpoint that he espouses very passionately. We don't know exactly what he read. In his later speeches, he didn't cite his sources very often. Some biographers take this to mean that he didn't really read very deeply. He didn't read many of the books, the great philosophers, the great writers that you would want to be able to quote in a political or philosophical discussion. And they propose that he's just reading newspapers and political tracts and has a very surface level understanding of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Goethe, these great German thinkers. I think he likely did read very deeply, and from some of the best authors. His friends all describe him frequently reading from books. They describe him frequently borrowing books. Also, if you read his speeches, there are enough subtle references to Nietzsche and Schopenhauer that I think he did read them. So he's reading a lot, and I do think he read great books as well as political tracts and anti-Semitic newspapers and stuff like that. So this is the picture we have of Hitler in Vienna. He lives there from when he is 18 years old until he is 24 years old. He's a pretty good painter, fairly polite guy. He loves to read and is developing a very strong political view. More on that in a bit. And he's a listless bohemian who only paints to live. As he made more, he would spend time in cafes and go to the operas, where he loved to see all the great operas, but especially Wagner. Again, I can't emphasize enough how different this is from someone like Napoleon or Julius Caesar. To be honest, the person it reminds me of, again, is Steve Jobs after he drops out from Reed College, right? Like, he's this guy, pretty smart, doesn't really have a goal in life, and isn't really working towards anything. So let's address this here, actually. Why does Adolf Hitler remind me so much of Steve Jobs? Both were bohemians who were obsessed with the arts as young men. Both had some technical ability, but neither was exceptional in that domain. Both had a very strong aesthetic sense. Both were artists, but they instantiated their artistic vision not through a traditional medium like painting or writing, but through organization. Both were extremists who insisted on perfection and on the very best. They had somewhat similar management styles. We'll talk more about that in subsequent episodes. Both had a tough time making friends outside of work. And the friendships they did make, they tended to dominate. You had to be a good listener to be friends with either of them. And the reason they were so similar is because they were both artists turned organizers. Steve Jobs channeled his creative energy into creating technology products. Hitler channeled his into creating the Third Reich. And obviously, I'm not saying this to tarnish the reputation of Steve Jobs by comparing him to Hitler. I love Steve Jobs and what he accomplished in life. I bring up the comparison because it is a specific archetype. And so if this sounds like you, and you're hearing the Hitler story and you're like, whoa, this is weird, this sounds like me, that's not a comfortable realization, then I think Steve Jobs is someone maybe that you can look to that's like maybe a more productive example of that archetype in action. All right, so let's talk about Hitler's intellectual development in Vienna. According to Hitler, the most important thing to happen to him in Vienna was his conversion to anti-Semitism. And by the way, anti-Semitic is a word Hitler did use to describe himself. It's not like today where no one would describe themselves as anti-Semitic or racist. All right, those are just insults. That, I can't think of anyone using to describe themselves. No, in fact, one of Hitler's first major speeches, once he entered politics, is called Why We Are Anti-Semites. All right, so this is a word that Hitler used about himself. He was anti-Semitic, he was an anti-Semite. This was core to his ideology, like he always said this. And Vienna, according to him, is when he becomes anti-Semitic. It starts with his frustration with the press, actually, because he didn't start out as anti-Semitic, is what he says. Because his father had been a respectable guy. Alois had viewed anti-Semitism as a low form of senseless bigotry. And Adolf Hitler initially had the same attitude. Anti-Semitism is for the great, unwashed, ignorant masses. Hitler said that it was a very difficult conversion from this viewpoint to full-throated anti-Semitism. He referred to the 2-year period in Vienna when he became anti-Semitic as, quote, the time of the greatest spiritual upheaval I have ever had to go through. And he's talking specifically about becoming an anti-Semite, okay? So according to him, this is not something that he wanted to do. It was a very difficult, like, spiritual battle to become anti-Semitic. All right, so why does he do it? What happens? In Mein Kampf, he describes an experience with a Jewish man who belonged to a very conservative sect of Judaism. Here's what he writes, quote, once as I was strolling through the inner city, I suddenly met a figure in a long kaftan with black curls. Is that a Jew? Was my first thought. Jews did not look like that in Linz. I covertly observed the man, but the longer I stared at that alien face, scrutinizing feature after feature, my question changed from is that a Jew to is that a German? As always, I tried to resolve my doubts through books. For a few coins, I bought the first anti-Semitic pamphlets I had ever purchased in my life. Unfortunately, they were all based on the theory that the reader grasped or at least was familiar in principle with the Jewish question. Their tone made me feel new doubts because of the often shallow and unscientific proofs they offered. I would relapse to my former way of thinking for weeks, sometimes months. The matter seemed so monstrous and the accusations so unrestrained that I feared it might be unjust for me to decide one way rather than another. And again, I became timid and uncertain. All right, so it starts off with this question. He sees a Jewish man and thinks, oh, is that a Jew? And then the question turns to, is that a German? You know, he doesn't look German to me. And that's a very clever reframing, right? And then Vienna was a hotbed of anti-Semitism. He's almost certainly reading anti-Semitic newspapers and imbibing those ideas. You know, he says his first introduction to anti-Semitic newspapers kind of turns him off, actually. And he has to consider anti-Semitism for a couple of years longer. But certainly, like, over and over, reading these tracts in these newspapers and being sort of steeped in that world obviously has an effect on Hitler. That's part of it. It's just he's in like a swamp of anti-Semitism and it's rubbing off on him. Other than this light bulb moment where he realizes that this Jewish man on the street is not really a German, there are a few other reasons he gives that turn his mind toward anti-Semitism. One is the dealings of the press. All right, he has a run-in with the communists via some unions, at least according to him. That's the story. Many people doubt the story, as do I. But I don't doubt that Hitler was very annoyed by the communists and socialists and probably had some bad experiences with them that turned him off. He is especially agitated by the Social Democrats, basically the center-left socialists. He finds their newspapers to be very dishonest. And he finds that most of the Social Democratic leadership are Jewish and that the owners of the newspapers who support them are mostly Jewish as well. Okay, so reading these newspapers and finding their arguments very disingenuous and then looking newspaper after newspaper, he's like, oh, writer, Jewish, owner, Jewish, writer, Jewish, owner, Jewish. And he's just seeing like, these people are lying to me. These Jews are lying to me. So his experience with the press is another thing that is formative in turning him towards anti-Semitism. By the way, I'm not going to like refute every one of his arguments. I'm just going to give you first his whole intellectual development. All right, that's maybe why I'm not responding to it right here. There's also the issue of the German working class in Vienna. He came from a socially stable community in northern Germany. Poverty certainly existed even within his own family. You know, his mother was very poor growing up. But in this environment, there was a strong sense of social cohesion, of stable family life, and of community. Well, he comes to Vienna, and for the first time, he is faced with the reality of the German underclass, the urban working poor. Now remember, Hitler is already a strong German nationalist. He loves his country, and he loves the German man, you know, the German people, and what that stands for, you know, Beethoven, Goethe, Leibniz. Well, all of a sudden, he's in Vienna, and it's shattering to his love of the average Germanic man. Imagine This is a good example. Imagine you are from a relatively nice suburb in America, and you end up a white supremacist. All right. Different time, kind of difficult to imagine now, but we'll stretch the analogy a little bit. Okay. So you come from like a nice suburb of New York, like northern New Jersey or Washington, D.C. You're from Bethesda, Maryland or something. Okay. So you believe in the superiority of the white man in America, Washington, Franklin, Edison, Roosevelt, Mark Twain, whatever. And then you have to take a job and you move to a trailer park in rural, wherever. I mean, frankly, it could be California, it could be Virginia, it could be anywhere. And it's not just the poverty that shocks you, but the social dysfunction. You know, this is an all-white trailer park, and the people are doing drugs. They're committing crimes. They lie. They cheat. They steal. They beat their spouses. All right, well, that is Hitler's experience basically in Vienna. So how do you maintain your love of your race and your nation despite the obvious shortcomings that you see on display every single day? And you could confront reality that, you know, Germans are a mixed bag. There's some good ones, there's some bad ones. Or, you know, this is Hitler. Everything has to be the best or the worst. It can't be. Germans cannot be a mixed bag. Germans have to be the absolute greatest people on earth, right? He's a man of extremes. And so the way he does it is he says, okay, well then this must be someone else's fault. Someone must be doing something to them. And so when you combine everything else we've been talking about, for Hitler, the Jews make a compelling scapegoat. They are the people who are doing this. If the pitiable circumstances of the working poor are due to the Jews, due to their money lending, their socialism, their gutter journalism, they're turning the people away from the good of the nation, well, then you can keep your view of the German people and their greatness intact. All right, here's what Hitler says about it in Mein Kampf, quote, "If I wanted to avoid falling into despair because of the people who surrounded me, I had to learn the distinctions between their outer character and inner life and the circumstances that created their lives. Only through this understanding could I bear it all without giving up to despair. It was no longer human beings who rose before me out of unhappiness and misery, out of squalor and physical degradation, but the sad products of sad laws. To me, dwelling on the social democratic literature and press meant finding my way back to my own people. What once seemed an impassable gulf now created in me a love greater than ever before. Only a fool, once he knows about this enormous work of corruption, could still condemn the victims." All right. And of course, you heard there the social democratic press, which of course, to reiterate the point, he equates with Jewry. Reading again from Mein Kampf, "I forced myself to at least make an attempt at reading this Marxist journalism, but the more I did, the more I disliked it. I now tried to get closer to the manufacturers of this mischievous words. From the editor on down, they were all Jews. I picked up every social democratic pamphlet I could and looked up the author's name, Jews. I noticed the names of almost all the leaders. Most of them were also members of the chosen people. The Jews, whether they were representatives in the government or secretaries of the union, chairmen of organizations or street agitators, the same uncanny picture was continually repeated. One thing was plain to me now. The leadership of the party whose petty representatives I had to fight my most violent battles with for months consisted almost exclusively of an alien people. I then had the happy satisfaction of knowing for certain that the Jew was no German. Now, for the first time, I became thoroughly familiar with the corrupter of our people." Okay? So again, to make the connection, it is by fighting an external enemy that he is able to recover his love for his own people, according to him. For that enemy, he identifies the social democratic press. And when he looks at the people who are actually active in that press, he finds that they are mostly Jews, and therefore he equates Jewry with the problem. So it is, according to him, again, this is what he says, it is his hatred of the Jews that allows him to maintain his good feeling toward Germans. And that's another factor in his developing anti-Semitism. And then finally, the final step in his evolution as an anti-Semite comes when he becomes familiar with the underworld of Vienna, specifically with the world of prostitution. And according to him, most of the pimps and proprietaries of prostitution houses are Jewish. And this does take it from a purely rational calculation. And for the first time, it makes him truly angry. In Mein Kampf, he writes, quote, "It sent a chill down my spine when I first realized the Jew was the manager of this immoral trade among the scum of the city. He was icy calm and shamelessly businesslike, which made me fuming angry. Now I no longer evaded discussing the Jewish question. Now I wanted to discuss it." Now, despite this contention, he actually does have frequent friendly interactions with Jewish people. And some historians, for this reason, doubt that Hitler actually did become anti-Semitic in Vienna. Their argument is that he likely became anti-Semitic after World War I, when many Germans also did. There's this general trend, this general movement in Germany toward anti-Semitism. But Hitler wanted to seem like a prophet. He wanted to seem ahead of the trend, ahead of the times. And so he post-dated his anti-Semitism to his time in Vienna. But I do think he's actually likely telling the truth in Mein Kampf. I think he really was becoming anti-Semitic in Vienna, because even after he was very publicly anti-Semitic, in fact, the leading anti-Semite in the world, he still never had bad personal encounters with Jews. He could still be very civil with them. In fact, when he was chancellor, when he was leading Germany, National Socialist Germany, Hitler would assign a government minister to make sure that the Jewish doctor who cared for his mother, this doctor who said, I've never seen someone so broken up by death as Hitler was for his mother. This was a Jewish doctor. So Hitler finds a government minister and says, hey, go find this doctor, and also go find the men who I served with, the Jewish men who I served with in World War I, and make sure that they make it safely out of the country without being harassed. Because this is at a time when the persecution of the Jews is starting in Germany. All right? that is so interesting psychologically, right? That the very man who is creating these policies specifically to persecute and kick out the Jews would go to the trouble to find Jews who had been personally kind to him and make sure they were taken care of. How to explain this paradox? And I think, this is just me talking, but I think the answer is that Hitler's anti-Semitism was cold hatred, not hot hatred. It was a reasoned, rational hatred. It was the product of step-by-step thought. I say rational. I don't mean rational in that like it was a good argument. I mean just rational in the fact of like, this wasn't a Jew kicked me in the shin, therefore I'm mad in the moment. No, he thought about it and he came to the conclusion that Jews needed to be exterminated from Germany and that they were not compatible with a healthy German society. And that's actually worse if you're Jewish than a hot hatred. Because if I'm just mad, well, then that anger will dissipate eventually. And maybe I'll be mad today and I'll try and do something to you today and it'll be bad, but it fades and things can return to normal. But if you have just coldly calculated, yeah, actually, these people need to go, well, then you're not going to stop until it's done, right? And in fact, as chancellor, Hitler opposed, for the most part, disorderly pogroms of Jews. He didn't want them eliminated in this kind of chaotic, old historical way, old-fashioned way. He wanted them eliminated in a modern, scientific, comprehensive way, right? So that's why I do think Hitler is anti-Semitic at this time, even though, yes, he is carrying on business relations with Jewish people. He's having conversations with Jewish people at the hostel. There are Jewish people who consider him, if not exactly friends, then like a friendly associate who they see and frequently talk with. And none of them report him ever making any anti-Semitic comments or treating them differently. But the reason is, yes, his intellectual development is doing one thing, but his personal behavior can just be very different for that reason. At the same time, he is developing other prejudices, and that is because the Habsburg Empire that he lives in, that is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is undergoing a change. It had started as a German empire, right? The Habsburgs are Germans, and their empire basically evolves out of the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically a German institution. So this Habsburg Empire is a German state with German kings and princes and ministers ruling over Germans in Austria, as well as many other non-German peoples in Central Europe. So within the borders of this empire, you have large numbers of Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Jews, and then South Slavs, right? Croats, Serbs, Slovenians, Bulgarians, so on and so forth. The Hungarians are powerful enough to get a seat at the table for a while, basically, which is why it's called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But it's still, this actually kind of goes back and forth, it's still basically Germans ruling over everyone else. Well, as time goes on, nationalism is rising everywhere in Europe. And these nations are no longer content to live under Germanic rule. Even though the Habsburgs rule quite benevolently, they're pretty hands-off, they give them a lot of autonomy, but still, all these minorities, basically, these smaller nationalities, they want actual representation. It's more than policy. It doesn't feel good to have Germans ruling over you. So the result is basically the equivalent to what in 2026 we might refer to as mass migration and DEI. The Habsburgs, the rulers of this Austrian Empire, don't want rebellions, and so they start increasingly making concessions. They give more and more government positions to non-Germans so that they will feel represented. And you can see why they would do this. The Czechs, they want their own state, all right? But for the Habsburgs, we still want a big empire. We want to rule over all this. That makes us more powerful. We don't want to let the Czechs go. So, hey, maybe if we start giving a portion of all government jobs to Czechs, they won't be so inclined to make trouble. And maybe if we allow them to move to Vienna, the wealthiest part of the empire, they'll be more content with the situation. Not only does it make strategic sense in the moment, but it makes moral sense, right? This isn't the Middle Ages. We can't just keep ruling over all these people. We have to give them some sort of representation. Okay, so that really makes sense from a Habsburg perspective, right? Why you would want to give all these government jobs to Croats and Czechs and Hungarians and Serbs and all these people. But from a nationalist perspective, from a German nationalist perspective of someone like Hitler, he just sees, hey, we used to have all these jobs and all this power and authority, and the Habsburgs are giving it away. And they are quickly turning Vienna into a non-German city. And all these positions that should be going to people like me, that should be increasing the wealth and market position of Germans, are now going to Czechs and Serbs and Jews and Hungarians. It's the same complaint that a lot of white people have about affirmative action, DEI, now in the 21st century. Obviously, I'm not trying to compare, again, people who have those complaints now to people back then, but it's kind of the same idea. There is a moral difference, anyways, but you can kind of think of it that way. It'll help you understand what Hitler's complaint is. People who had been the overwhelming ethnic majority and who had a state of their own that served them are suddenly being disadvantaged by that same state, and they perceive themselves becoming ethnic minorities in their own country. And so Hitler is not just anti-Semitic, he is anti-Slavic as well, though not nearly to the same extent. Like, he views anti-Semitism as central to his worldview in like the thing that kind of solves everything else. His anti-Slavic views are not nearly as central, but that is a part of his worldview, and he's very opposed to the Habsburg Empire. He much prefers the German state, Germany, that had been created by Bismarck, okay? Now the question arises, if he hates this multicultural international Austria and prefers Germany so much, why is he living in Vienna? And that is because he is the son of a deceased Austrian minister. So he's going to get a big payout when he turns 24. He'll get his full inheritance from the Austrian state. That is the only reason for his staying in Austria. So in 1913, he turns 24, he gets his big payout, and he decides to move. He moves to Munich in southern Germany. All right, so once again, let's summarize Hitler's time in Vienna. He lives there from age 18 to age 24. He applies to art school and is rejected, probably twice. He hits rock bottom. He manages to pull himself back up to a modestly successful bohemian lifestyle by selling paintings on the street. He attends the opera as frequently as possible. He reads widely. He develops his political outlook, which includes anti-Semitism, opposition to the multicultural Habsburg Empire, as well as support for a unified German state, a state by Germans for Germans. So that is Hitler in Vienna. He then moves to Munich in order to be a part of the German state that he is so enamored with. There was, however, another less idealistic reason for his leaving to Munich. The Austrian government required military service for all able-bodied young men, and Hitler does not want to serve the Austrian government. So he's able to sneak out of Austria and into Germany, but the Austrian authorities soon alert Munich police, who scoop him up and take him back to Austria to go to trial. In court, he makes a pitiable sight, right? He's kind of down on his luck. He's doing better than he was. He's not really homeless anymore, but still, he's very thin. He's not eating super well. He's got all these shabby clothes. and he convinces the authorities that he has been living near the poverty line, which they accept, and are willing to waive the penalties for skipping military service. But, they say, you do still have to go serve in the army. But he goes, he shows up, they test him, they give him a physical, and he is deemed too weak for the army. An awkward fact that he would have to cover up later. It's also possible that he was basically sandbagging it. He wanted to fail this test so that he wouldn't have to serve in the Austrian army. So he returns to Munich, free from the specter of serving a government that he never loved. Once again, Hitler begins selling small paintings and postcards. Once again, he uses Jewish partners to help him sell them. And just like Vienna, he's able to afford a modest bohemian lifestyle. He claims to want to become an architect or an architectural painter, but he takes no concrete steps to make that happen. The pattern is exactly the same as Vienna. He uses all his spare time to read and engage with the arts, especially opera. He hangs out in cafes and hostels where he argues politics. And there his life basically hit stasis. He had hit rock bottom in 1909, but from 1910 to 1914, he's basically doing the same thing, reading widely, being this bohemian painter. But that would all be upended a year after moving to Munich on June 28th, 1914. On that day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. When Hitler heard about the assassination, he assumed it must have been a German nationalist who did this. After all, remember, from Hitler's perspective, he had been living in a thoroughly anti-German state in the Habsburg Empire. In Hitler's view, the Habsburgs are practically giving away the empire to all these ethnic minorities. So if anyone is going to be upset, it's going to be a young German who was seeing his birthright sold for a mess of pottage. But it turns out that it wasn't. It was a Serb nationalist, actually. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "The greatest friend to Slavs was brought down by a fanatical Slav patriot's bullet." And the fact that it actually was a Serbian nationalist, shows exactly why the Habsburgs were acting the way they were, right? They were under intense pressure, both from German nationalists who wanted to know why they're giving so many privileges to non-Germans, and from these other nationalists who want political freedom and representation. Okay, well, of course, this incident sets off the events that would culminate in the First World War. Serbia proper actually wasn't in the Austrian Empire, but Bosnia was, which had a large Serbian population, and nationalists like Princip wanted the unification of all Serbs, all of Yugoslavia, actually. So Austria demands action from the Serbian government. The Serbian government rejects some of their demands. Russia, as a Slavic power, had promised protection to Serbia. So Austria invades Serbia, since they won't give them everything they want in recompense for the assassination. Germany stands with Austria. Russia defends Serbia. France has an alliance with Russia. Germany invades Belgium to get to France. Belgium has an alliance with Britain. Voila. You have this great entanglement of alliances, and you have just entangled yourself into a world war. No one anticipated just how horrific the First World War would be. Hitler certainly didn't. He celebrated the outbreak of war. In fact, there is a photo of him smiling in Munich's Central Plaza. Actually, some people do speculate that the photo might have been faked, which is certainly possible. However, we have no reason to doubt that Hitler was, in fact, ecstatic at the outbreak of World War I. So Hitler joins the war in the German army, despite being an Austrian citizen. He claimed that he was able to do this because he wrote a letter to King Ludwig III of Bavaria to ask if he could serve in the Bavarian army. We don't know for sure whether Ludwig really did grant him permission to serve in the German army, or whether the recruitment office simply failed to check his citizenship. Either way, the upshot is Hitler is able to serve in the German army, which is a huge relief for him because, again, he loves Germany, does not love Austria. For Hitler, the war was a blissful end to the uncertainty and listlessness that he felt in Vienna and Munich. He felt truly at ease for the first time in years, and the army gave him structure, identity, and meaning. He later called it, quote, "the greatest and most unforgettable time of my earthly existence, and the one time when I had no worries." Overpowered by stormy enthusiasm, he wrote, "I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live at this time." Right? So that gives you the picture. Hitler is just consumed with excitement and gratitude to be able to fight on behalf of a German state. I think part of this overwhelming feeling is also finding structure in his life. right? And part finding meaning as well. He did find meaning in art, but I think he had been deluding himself a little bit. I do think that politics had always been the thing that had given him the most meaning. In the army, he serves as a regimental dispatch runner, essentially a messenger. And this was not a combat role, but it was a very dangerous position, and casualty rates were extremely high. Messengers, in fact, were often sent out in pairs because the chance of death was so great, and they wanted to make sure that at least one of them would make it with the message. They were generally conveying orders from the regimental headquarters to the front line, and then situation reports from the front lines back to regimental headquarters. And messengers had to beware of sniper fire, artillery attacks, poison gas, and more. Messages were taken either on foot or on bike. And Hitler, by all accounts, from all of his comrades, all of his officers, anyone associated with him, was unusually reliable and brave. He was well liked for his commitment and dependability, though he was considered somewhat odd. He didn't socialize much with the other men. He didn't form close friendships or engage in joking. He had an intense, focused personality, and it's pretty similar to the Hostiles, actually. He often sits alone, painting or reading, brooding and thinking in the corner, and lecturing other people about politics. But again, he was well liked. He was seen as an oddity, not as an outcast. On one occasion, he was in the regimental headquarters and left for a routine message delivery, only minutes before the building was shelled and everyone inside was killed. This story is well attested and almost certainly true. There's another story. According to Mein Kampf, on another occasion, he was sitting down for dinner when a voice told him to move. He looked around and thought, that's odd, but obeyed the voice and got up and moved. He sat down about 20 yards away with his dinner and began to eat again when a shell exploded just where he had been. He said that this incident made him feel like he had a special purpose or destiny. And of course, that story is not verifiable. How would you even verify that he had heard a voice? But what we do know is that Hitler was a particularly brave messenger and, frankly, a lucky one, that he wasn't killed in many opportunities when he could have been. And he did receive an Iron Cross, which is the highest honor that he could have received for repeatedly volunteering for dangerous missions, for reliability and calm under fire, and for long continuous service at the front. Hitler made the rank of corporal. He was actually put forward for promotion beyond that, but he rejected it because he wanted to stay with his regiment. And I think that tells you something about the kind of belonging and purpose that he felt, that he was willing to turn down a promotion just to stay with these men. Now, Hitler was undoubtedly brave, but he admits in Mein Kampf that as time went on, quote, horror had replaced the romance of battle. Enthusiasm gradually cooled down and the wild excitement was smothered in deadly fear. For each man, the time came when he had to struggle between the instinct of self-preservation and the obligations of duty. I was not exempt from this struggle. Whenever death was close, a vague something in me tried to revolt and tried to disguise itself as reason to the weak body, but it was still just that sly cowardice laying sneaky traps. A great tugging and warning would begin, and only the last remnant of conscience would get me through the day. But the harder this voice worked to caution me, and the louder and more piercingly it spoke to me, the stiffer my resistance became, until finally, after a long inner struggle, duty won. The thing that makes him brave, according to this passage, is not that he just happens to have the personality attribute of bravery. It's belief. He really believes in the German nation, and that genuine belief makes him brave, makes him willing to sacrifice for this greater cause. Okay, now the one great friendship that he formed during the war was not with fellow soldiers, was not with officers. It was actually with a dog, a white terrier who had strayed across enemy lines and whom he named Füchsel, meaning little fox. They became very, very close. The dog went everywhere with him. He taught it tricks, and by all accounts, the dog was always extremely happy to see him when he returned from duty. So that's Hitler at war. He's brave, he loves being with his regiment, he's got this dog. And throughout the first years of the war, Hitler was incredibly lucky to avoid serious injury, but on October 7th, 1916, his luck finally ran out. At the Battle of the Somme, a massive British shell exploded nearby, killing several comrades and sending shards into Hitler's thigh. Despite wanting to stay with his regiment, the lieutenant in charge ordered him to go to a field hospital for treatment. After several days, he was transferred to Berlin's military hospital. There, he was shocked by the morale of the men. Many were pessimistic about the war. They thought anyone a fool who served willingly, and they openly discussed how to avoid going back to the front, even going so far as suggesting intentionally injuring themselves. Hitler was outraged, but he was in the minority. He's haranguing them. He's telling them this is terrible. And this big group is just like, yeah, whatever, man. We're not going back. This war sucks. After 2 months, he was declared fit for service again and sent to Munich, where once again he finds the morale in Munich was even worse than Berlin. Quote, anger, discontent, cursing wherever you went, Hitler wrote. Groceries were scarce. Poverty was everywhere. So Hitler is totally disgusted with his Munich battalion, just full of young recruits, low morale, lack of discipline. And so he requests to join his old regiment in France. And that request was granted. So imagine this guy, he's a dispatch runner. He's at the front. He's in very dangerous circumstances. And finally, a shell does explode and injures him very grievously to the point that he's out for months. And he goes back to Munich, and he can't believe that people just aren't patriotic in supporting the war when his regiment at the front had been patriotic. And so he goes back into the fray, back to the danger. Again, obviously, things get worse in the future, and we will talk about the things that you can fault Hitler for. He really does have this sincere love for and belief in the nation of Germany. His comrades welcome him back. The happiest of all was Fuchsel, who, quote, hurled himself on me in a frenzy. In April 1917, the United States joined the war, reinforcing British and French troops. Hitler's regiment was transferred to a fight at Ypres in Belgium, where the fighting was far fiercer than before. Armored tanks appeared on the battlefield, and poison gas was widely used in this area. The war had fully settled down into the terrible, grinding horror show that we are all so familiar with today. Men huddled in trenches in feet of water. They shivered and coughed as disease took its horrific toll. Rats chewed on corpses. Poison gas devastated the landscape and killed men in ways even more gruesome than sniper fire and machine guns. It's just, World War II was terrible in some ways. The war in Ukraine right now seems really bad, but I don't know that there has ever been a war as horrific as World War I for those fighting it. Many men just broke under the pressure and never recovered. And during these most horrible moments of the war, Hitler's greatest tragedy befell him. So what was it? Was it the death of a comrade? Was it another personal injury? Was it the loss of battle? No. During a movement of troops, apparently some other German soldiers made off with his little dog Fuchsel. And Hitler, I'm not joking when I say that this was the greatest tragedy of the war for him. He never got over it. The strongest words in Mein Kampf, like the most vulgar words that he uses, are not for the Jews, they're not for the Anglos or the French, not for the Russians, not for the communists. The strongest words he uses is in the sentence, quote, "The swine who took him from me doesn't know what he did to me." That word swine at the time meant something closer to scumbag. It was like a borderline curse word. I think actually probably the best translation would probably be, that bastard who took him from me doesn't know what he did to me. All right. And so, much has been made of this. Many people try and psychologize Hitler over this. And it is honestly psychologically remarkable that Hitler's best friend was a dog, someone who would obey his every order, right? There probably is something to that. Anyway, as you might know, the war goes badly for Germany. Russia suffers a revolution, which frees up soldiers from the Eastern Front to go take on the French, English, and Americans on the Western Front. However, a blockade slowly forces Germany into submission. Resources are few, hunger is widespread. Fueled by a lack of food, disease is rampant, both in the trenches and back home. And this lack of resources spells disaster for the German war effort. Hitler's regiment is retreating to Belgium on the night of October 13th, when he gets hit with a blast of mustard gas from the British. He hacks and coughs, his lungs take some damage, but the real problem is his eyes. The gas gets into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. He is sent to a military hospital, where he recovers over the coming weeks, and where he hears of the German surrender. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "And so it had all been in vain all the sacrifices and privations, in vain the hunger and thirst of months which were often endless, in vain the hours in which, with mortal fear clutching at our hearts, we nevertheless did our duty, and in vain the death of 2 millions who died. Would not the graves of all the hundreds of thousands open, the graves of those who with the faith in the fatherland had marched forth never to return? Would they not open and send the silent mud and blood-covered heroes back as spirits of vengeance to the homeland, which had cheated them with such mockery of the highest sacrifice which a man can make to his people in this world? Since the day when I had stood at my mother's grave, I had not wept. When in my youth fate had seized me with merciless hardness, my defiance mounted. When in the long war years, death snatched so many a dear comrade and friend from our ranks, it would have seemed to me almost a sin to complain. After all, were they not dying for Germany? And so I bore my lot in dull silence. But now I could not help it. Only now did I see how all personal suffering vanishes in comparison with the misfortune of the fatherland. All right, so this is like the great tragedy of Hitler's life, at least since his mother's death. Now, one important detail about the process of capitulation is that there was a general strike which crippled the German war effort. Hitler blamed this strike for Germany's humiliating loss. In his eyes, the Germans were becoming dispirited. Yes, they were in a bad condition. There was this blockade. But the French and British were also bruised and bloodied. However, the news that the German factories had gone on strike convinced the American Germans and French that they only needed to push for a few more weeks to achieve victory. And similarly, it caused the German soldiers to lose the feeling that success was still possible. Militarily, Germany was never forced back into German territory. They surrendered after a strike and a political capitulation, while German soldiers were still holding positions in France. Now, there were legitimate reasons for the surrender. People were starving to death. Are you just going to let more people starve when it really looks like you can't win? But to many people like Hitler, it seemed like cowardice at best, a stab in the back at worst. And this idea of a stab in the back becomes very popular in Germany. With his pre-existing anti-Semitic views, he didn't have to think long about who it was that had delivered this stab in the back. It was the Jewish socialists who convinced the factory workers to go on strike. It was the Jewish press who had convinced people that they didn't need to fight anymore. It was the Jews who were sowing dissension back home. Now, to be fair, Hitler did not blame the Jews alone. He also felt incredible anger toward those German politicians and political parties who had decided to surrender rather than fight. There are plenty of targets for his wrath, but he comes back to Munich greatly embittered and with more resolve than ever to fight. In the immediate wake of World War I, there was a revolution in Germany. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated his throne, and the Deutschreich came to an end. 2 days later, the new Social Democratic government signed an armistice agreement with the Allies. Germany continued to be racked with political unrest as Hitler was discharged from his hospital. Remember, Russia leaves the war because they had just undergone a communist revolution, and they're practically right next door to Germany. It seems very likely that Germany was next. In fact, there is a lot of Soviet influence to try to accomplish exactly this. The only thing standing in the way of the Soviets, of the communists from taking over, are these extra-legal paramilitary units of discharged soldiers who go around suppressing communists wherever they go. They are called the Freikorps. Hitler, though horrified by this stab in the back, does not join a division of Freikorps and instead stays in the employ of the German army for as long as possible. He goes back to Munich, where he's still employed by the army, doing odd jobs like testing out gas masks to see if they're still functioning, counting inventory, things like that. And the situation in Bavaria is extremely volatile. For more than 1,000 years, Germany had not truly been united. It had been ruled by various princedoms and duchies and free cities and prince-bishoprics and all these kind of funny small arrangements. It was rarely united. German statelets only loosely coordinated with other German states through the very weak Holy Roman Empire. Bismarck had unified Germany under a single state, but that had only been a few decades previous. So there was still a feeling that the entire German project might fall apart, or that it might go back to being a very loose federation. At the same time, you have these communists running around trying to turn Germany into a communist state. And these Freikorps, who don't have a clear political objective, but are exerting influence from the far right. Okay, so you got independence movements trying to kind of splinter apart Germany. You got the far right, you got the far left, all kind of playing this game of tug of war over Germany. Bavaria is the region that Munich is in, and it's one of the largest and most populous in Germany, and it had a very strong identity and a long history of independence. And it's one of the most viable as an independent state. Like, if Bavaria was independent, it's close to as large and prosperous as Austria. So like it could survive as an independent state. So Germany as a whole is volatile, and Bavaria in particular is like a powder keg within a powder keg. I won't go through the whole history here. Bavaria actually does go communist for a little bit. It is ruled under what is called the Councils Republic. Right? Council, that's a very nice euphemism. We're ruled by some councils. All right. You know what the Russian word for councils is? That's right, it's Soviet. All right. So Bavaria is a Soviet republic for a bit, but then it goes back and ends up with a sort of center-left social democratic government. On April 14th, 1919, the Munich Soldiers' Council conducted fresh elections for barracks representatives, and Hitler was chosen as a deputy battalion representative. So in other words, Hitler is elected to represent the soldiers' views and interests to the government. So Hitler is seen as something of a leader in the army when it comes to political matters. One of their immediate priorities was the creation of an information department designed to educate troops against Bolshevism in order to prevent another Council's Republic. Hitler was assigned to the department under Captain Karl Meyer, who viewed him as something of a mentee. He was soon placed in educational work focused on anti-Bolshevism and history. Hitler performed surprisingly well, particularly when he took the stage during classes. A superior later noted, quote, "Herr Hitler is a born people speaker. He clearly compels the attention of his listeners and makes them think his way." So people are noticing already that, this guy, he's good. He's pretty good at this whole propaganda thing. Outside of his duties in the information department, Hitler was tasked with surveilling roughly 50 political parties ranging from the far right to the far left. So he's essentially working in military intelligence. And he's seeing what these parties are up to and making sure they aren't planning anything or being seditious, not planning any rebellions. It was in this capacity that he was deployed to spy on the German Workers' Party. If you've been listening to this show for a while, you have heard me advertise Founders. Well, now the host of Founders, David Senra, has a new show where he interviews some of the greatest living founders. And I mean the greats. He's got long-form conversations with people like Daniel Ek of Spotify, Michael Dell, and Michael Ovitz of CAA. They are very in-depth conversations that really strike at the heart of what motivates them, how they think, and what actions they have taken to become the greats in their industries. I really love it. It's another great podcast from David Senra. So check it out. That podcast is called simply David Senra, and you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. This episode is brought to you by Zashi Wallet, where you can buy and store Zcash. Encryption is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. Encryption preserves your privacy and your anonymity and helps return to you the sense of freedom that past generations experienced. And Zcash is encrypted Bitcoin, digital cash that protects your agency and safety by encrypting your wealth. And that is something I really believe in. The idea that everyone, including governments and banks, would know what I am doing whenever I make a purchase is just horrible to me. So consider Zcash. You can buy, store, and spend Zcash using the Zashi wallet, and you can find it in the App Store or Google Play Store. So give it a try. Again, that is Zashi, Z-A-S-H-I wallet, and you can get it wherever you get your apps. Before we get into Hitler's time in the Workers' Party, let's recap where we've been. So since he leaves Vienna, Hitler is briefly in Munich for a year. He joins the German army. He serves with distinction in World War I, wins the Iron Cross. The men in his regiment are disciplined, patriotic, motivated, and capable. Everything that a German man should be. They like him. He likes them. He's injured twice. The first time taking him out of action for several months, and then the second time takes him out of action for the final days of the war. Now he has returned to Munich, where he continues to work for the German army, at first doing pretty menial stuff, then working in the propaganda arm of the army, and then in domestic intelligence. So now he is 30 years old, and yeah, he's working in military intelligence for the German army. And he is assigned to go to a meeting of this new German Workers' Party. The German Workers' Party was actually a creation of something called the Thule Society, which was a group of aristocratic and wealthy German men who had an interest in what were called Volkisch ideas. So Volkisch ideas is the idea that all of the German Volk, the folk, all the German people should be united. And what is it that unites us? You know, looking at ancient German language and ancient German practices and German paganism, and it's kind of this esoteric society. Okay. So a few members of this Thule Society get together and say, you know, it's interesting that we can get successful people together to talk about this stuff, But if we want to get anything done, we need to go to the people, capital T, capital P, the people. Many members of the Thule Society disagree, and a lot of people are like, yeah, that's not what we're about. But 4 men agree. And so they do this together. Their names are Anton Drexler, Dietrich Eckart, Gottfried Feder, and Karl Herrer. And so they think, yeah, this is a good idea. We should take these Volkish ideas from the Thule Society and we should take it to the masses through this thing that we will call the German Workers' Party. And at first it doesn't get much traction. There were a few dozen members, but no real momentum. And then Adolf Hitler was assigned by the military to go check out a meeting and see what they were all about. Again, at this point, the military is mostly trying to keep a lid on the far left socialist movements, but this German Workers' Party is a little confusing, right? It's a workers' party. These military officers see that and they're like, sounds socialist to me, workers, But it's also a German party, and that sounds pretty nationalist. So it really is like a fact-finding mission. Like Hitler, go find out what's going on. Is this a left-wing party? Is this a right-wing party? What do they want, and do we have to worry about them? Here's how he describes what happens next in Mein Kampf. Quote, "So I resolved to attend the previously mentioned party meeting since I was not familiar with them and had not heard of them before. When I arrived that evening and went to the back room of the former Sternecker Brewery beer hall, which is now a place of historical significance, there were about 20 or 25 people, mostly from the lower class. I was already familiar with Feder's lectures through the courses I had taken, so I focused primarily on observing the society itself. It did not make a good or bad impression on me. It was just another new organization. Those were the days when anyone who was dissatisfied with previous developments and had lost confidence in the existing parties thought he should start a new party. Such societies sprang up like mushrooms everywhere, but disappeared without a squeak after a short time. Most of the founders did not have the slightest idea what it meant to turn a social gathering into a political party, let alone a movement. So the groups they founded almost always drowned in their own ridiculous pettiness. After listening for about 2 hours, I decided that the German Workers' Party could be lumped in with the rest. I had seen enough and was getting ready to go when they announced that there would be an open discussion. With that, I was persuaded to stay a while longer. Nothing of any consequence happened here until suddenly a professor took the floor. He urged strongly the young party to adopt the separation of Bavaria from Prussia as an important point of the party program. The man brazenly continued to insist that German Austria would immediately unite with Bavaria, that the peace would then be much better, and he continued with similar nonsense. At this point, I could not resist asking for my turn on the floor and telling the learned gentleman my opinion on the subject. I spoke with such success that before I had even finished, my predecessor on the floor left the hall with his tail between his legs. People looked astonished as they listened to me talk." All right. So Hitler gives his successful speech. But that is actually not what really converts him to the German Workers' Party. It's an experience after the meeting breaks up. Quote, "When I was saying goodnight to the group and starting to leave, a man came running after me to introduce himself and handed me a booklet that was evidently a political pamphlet. He begged me to read it. I did not catch the man's name. I thought this was very convenient because now I could become acquainted with the tiresome society without having to attend any more of their tiresome meetings. The man, obviously a workman, did leave a favorable impression on me though. Then I left. The morning after the meeting, I was laying awake in bed at 5 o'clock, watching the mice scurrying about. I couldn't go back to sleep, and I suddenly remembered the night before, and then the booklet that the man had asked me to read. So I began to read it. It was a small pamphlet in which the author, this very workman who gave it to me, described how he had escaped the Marxist and trade union slogans and returned to thinking on nationalistic lines. The title was My Political Awakening. Once I started reading, I consumed the pamphlet with interest all the way through. It described a process which reminded me of the one I had gone through 12 years before. I recalled my own development again. I thought about the matter several times throughout the day and was ready to put it aside again when less than a week later I received a postcard stating that I had been made a member of the German Workers' Party. The card asked what I thought about this and would I please come and share these thoughts at a committee meeting of the party the following Wednesday. All right, so it's kind of fluke circumstances that leads to Hitler joining this party. And they have this clever recruiting practice, which is, congratulations, you're a member of our party. What would you come tell us what you think about that? And so, he's thinking, all right, so technically I'm a member. I'm not really a member. Should I actually go and join? Should I not? And according to Hitler, he subsequently decides to join the party, not because it's going places, but because it isn't. Because it is an empty vessel. It's something that he can control and make his own. Quote, "I began to ask questions, but I found that other than a few guiding principles, there was nothing. No program, no printed material at all, no membership card, not even a humble rubber stamp of the party seal. All I saw was good faith and good intentions." All right, but that's enough for him. Good faith and good intentions. Here was a party that was at least seeking after the heart of the German workers. In Hitler's viewpoint, that was more than the other political parties could say. Now, this start of his relationship with the German Workers' Party, which would go on to become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what we know as the Nazi Party, he mythologizes the details somewhat. For example, he claims to have been the 7th member of the party, and the official paperwork has been found. He was actually the 55th member of the party. Hilariously, and this is actually a pretty good strategy, they start the numbering at 500 to make the party seem bigger. So the first member got the membership card number 501, the second member number 502. So Hitler has the card 555 because he was the 55th member of the German Workers' Party. But despite some of the mythologization, everyone does seem to agree that he demonstrated a remarkable speaking ability right from his very first speech. Anton Drexler, one of the founding members, heard his initial remarks and reportedly said to others, quote, "Goodness, he can speak. We could use him." Of course, he had it backwards regarding who would be using whom. For the next 6 months, Hitler was given ample time to work and train as a propagandist in the army, while also developing his own speeches within the German Workers' Party. He very quickly rises in the party as a speaker. He goes from being one of the best speakers to being the headline speaker within the party, to being the face of the party. Like, he's basically, in a very short amount of time, synonymous with the German Workers' Party. So much so that in March of 1920, he leaves the military and becomes a full-time speaker for the German Workers' Party. 1920 is the year that his profile really grows as a public speaker, and by the start of 1921, Hitler is attracting thousands of attendees to every rally that he speaks at. This is really remarkable. It's been about 18 months since Hitler started speaking publicly, and he is filling massive venues, some of the biggest venues in Munich. His biggest speech yet comes in February of 1921, where for the first time he addresses an audience of thousands. So what is Hitler doing that makes him so effective that everyone wants to come see him speak? And I want to break it down into 3 categories: the event, the speech, and the marketing. All right. First of all, the event. If I had to distill a Hitler speaking event during this time into one word, it would be excitement. He understood that a political rally is an entertainment event, which might seem simple, but very few people really seem to grasp that. These professors would get up and drone on and on about policies and theories, but the main thing about a Hitler rally is that something would happen. Hitler's speeches themselves were exciting, and then there would be a possibility for others to speak, and inevitably, some leftists, some socialists would show up to argue with him. They didn't realize that this was good for the German Workers' Party. Controversy sells. People want to come to meetings to see fireworks, to see what will happen next. So he's using like the Charlie Kirk model. I am a National Socialist. Prove me wrong, right? All respect to Charlie, who I'm not trying to morally equate with Hitler, obviously. Rest in peace. It also reminds me of a Donald Trump rally, right? Why do you go to a Trump rally? Because you don't know what is going to happen. You don't know what he's going to say. A Trump rally, he's not debating so much, but he's riffing Trump all the time. And so he could say something about anything. You never know. So Hitler's doing it in a different way, but it's the same impulse. Things happen at a Trump rally, and things happened at a Hitler rally. It really felt like it's not just a regurgitation of some talking points. It's not academic. It is news. It reminds me of, again, like a new product announcement from Steve Jobs at Apple. And the reason that they were so good when he was in charge and they're so bad now is that something was happening, right? Because a Tim Cook announcement should be better, right? It's all pre-recorded. That should be better, right? You can show off the product in its perfect state. Nothing can go wrong. Everything is optimal. But no, the product announcements suck now because people love drama. They love the uncertainty of a contest or a performance, the excitement of wondering what will happen next. And that's what you get at a National Socialist rally with Hitler speaking. And it's not just debate. There's also audience participation, call and response, chanting, stuff like that. I mean, think about all the ways you could participate that have become famous, right? The Roman salute, Sieg Heil, Heil Hitler, and there's a lot of that. A lot of Hitler saying something and everyone going, Heil, Sieg Heil, throwing up the Roman salute, cheering, booing. Like, the audience is very involved. All right? A poor political event or rally is one that you simply show up and passively attend. A great rally is one you participate in, and Hitler was great at creating that. Reading from a biography of Hitler by Brendan Sims, quote, one eyewitness, his first biographer, Conrad Hayden, recalled that the secret of the success of his speeches was that the audience became participants rather than listeners. Okay, so the first dynamic is the feeling that a Hitler rally is one where things happen and where excitement is generated and where people feel like participants. So let's move on to the speeches themselves. What was it about them? So let's read some quotes from Mein Kampf to illustrate what exactly he was going for. One is that he was willing to go to the beer halls and he felt comfortable there compared to his more genteel competitors. He met people where they were. Quote, the foul smell rising from mass gatherings offended the sensibilities of these gentlemen. They had no love for the beer halls and would still find it painful today if a great turn of events were to occur in the beer halls. Although one might ask, which is actually better, a parliament or a pub? All right. So one thing is that he speaks to the people. He's comfortable with them. He's comfortable in the beer halls, and others are not. He goes on. But the most important reason why the bourgeoisie could no longer win over the broad masses is that it did not possess a fundamentally new worldview. You must regard this, my dear German comrades, as the most important and most difficult characteristic. For when a movement fights forward today with a certain goal in mind, then this movement also has an endpoint visible to all. Okay? So a fundamentally new and exciting message, a new worldview, was at the center of his appeal. I talked about this in the Machiavelli episode, but it's the idea of apocalypsis, of revelation, of unveiling, showing the future, making the secret known to your audience. And Hitler was phenomenal at this. In fact, so much so that one biographer, R.H.S. Stolfi, says that Hitler cannot be regarded as a political figure. He says, quote, Hitler was neither a politician nor engaged in politics, and he cannot be considered to have believed that he was a wicked man perpetrating evil deeds. Hitler had the intense psychological makeup of a prophetically styled messiah, one whose office he believed was to reveal a message of salvation to the Germans and to become the savior hero himself. The landscape through which he moved was that of a Germany defeated in war and a European continent dominated by France. To think of Hitler as a German politician engaged in national politics would be like thinking of the quintessential prophet Muhammad as an Arab politician engaged in similar political endeavors. Both must be comprehended as intense visionaries with their feet planted firmly several feet above the ground in their own worlds of self-inspired revelation. Both achieved astonishing political results, but neither can be understood as a political ideologue. In fact, I think when you begin to think of Hitler as a prophet, a lot begins to fall in place. For example, no one really knows how much Hitler read because he never cites his sources. He rarely, if ever, quotes from works of philosophy or policy when he speaks. Why? Because a prophet doesn't quote. A prophet doesn't research. A prophet gives you the truth straight from heaven, right? Jesus was the same way. Jesus did quote scripture, but as Matthew 7 says, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes, right? So Jesus, he gives you the feeling that he has authority in and of himself. He is giving you revelation that he knows, that he has straight from heaven. And Hitler gave the same feeling, right? That's why he didn't quote from his sources very much, because Hitler had the truth, okay, as a prophetic figure. One biographer echoed this well when he writes, quote, characteristically, messiahs announce themselves. No committee marches in advance to announce their arrivals. Hitler would elaborate on this theme by claiming that, quote, in world history, the man who really arises above the broad average usually announces himself personally. All right. So like Jesus, like Muhammad, Hitler is a prophetic figure here to reveal the truth to you. Again, I'm putting this in Hitler's context. I don't actually believe this. I don't know how many times I need to make that clear. He was not a boring politician come to explain some policies to you. He was here to reveal the truth. All right, so that's one aspect of his speeches that makes them so compelling. What else? The most obvious one, the one visible to everyone, is his extreme passion. Here's what Hitler said about it, quote, only a storm of hot passion can turn the destinies of peoples, and he alone who bears it within himself can arouse passion. The storm alone gives the chosen one the words which, like hammer blows, can open the gates to the hearts of a people. Here's an account from a man by the name of Ledecky about his impressions of Hitler from seeing him speak for the first time. Quote, slight, pale man, threatening and beseeching, flaming steel blue eyes, the look of a fanatic, holding the masses and me with them under hypnotic spell by the sheer force of his conviction. voice rising to passionate climaxes. Then two words like the sting of a lash. Awake Germany. The intense will of the man, the passion of his sincerity, seemed to flow into me. I experienced an exaltation that could be likened only to religious conversion. All right. So again, Hitler, it is interesting to watch him speak because it doesn't really play in the 21st century. Like if you go watch a Hitler speech translated, it's okay, but I don't know, it doesn't set you on fire. But I do think it was that passion and that conviction that really came through at the time. All right. Let me hit on a few other ideas that I picked up from reading his speeches. One is pathos. Okay. Aristotle identified three components of great rhetoric: ethos, pathos, and logos. And of those, pathos is emotion, is personal connection. And Hitler does a phenomenal job at this. He always starts where the audience is, puts himself side by side with them, sympathizes with them, and in so doing subtly shifts your attitude to see things like he does. So for example, he gets put on trial for trying to start a coup. We'll learn more about that in a little bit. And he gives a speech at this trial. He's got this hostile audience. They think he might be a criminal. He's on trial for being a criminal. He couldn't have less credibility. And here is how he starts his speech. Quote, "It seems strange to me that a man who, as a soldier, became accustomed to blind obedience for nearly 6 years should suddenly come into conflict with the state and its constitution. To explain this, I must go back to my youth." And then he goes back and tells his biography. But do you see what he did there? In one sentence, he portrayed himself as a fundamentally obedient and peaceful person. And he piques your interest with the intriguing question of why this very obedient soldier would do something so crazy. And so he has framed the situation for you. And he has framed a question for you. He has successfully got you to believe his premise that he's a fundamentally obedient person. And you are wondering yet now, oh yeah, what would have made him do this? Someone so obedient. So it's this amazing job of suddenly putting himself with you. You're now beside him. You're now thinking the way he thinks. You're seeing the question the way that he sees it. He is very good across all his speeches, especially at the beginning with a moment of pathos. Let me give you another example from a speech titled "Freedom or Slavery." Quote, "My dear fellow Germans, a sudden commotion has come over the German people. Now even those circles are beginning to stir which until now had been deaf to the constant warnings that we have been trying to address to the mass of our people almost without interruption for the past 3 years. Of course, many people still do not know why they are upset. They believe that perhaps it is only about so-called special privileges, or about the restriction of freedom of speech, or about the politicization of the civil service, and so on. Certainly all these are extremely serious matters. Today, however, it is about much more." Okay? So smart. I love his use of many people, all right? Many people don't know what the present commotion is about. They're confused and wrong. Not you, of course. You get it. You're like me, all right? But many people, they don't get it. I'm going to explain it for their benefit. All right? He's getting chummy with you. Like you're on the inside with him, even as he's explaining to you why you should believe what he believes. Two other points. One is his use of repetition. Again, from Mein Kampf, quote, "Any effective propaganda must be confined to a very few points, and these must be expressed in simple stereotyped formulas. They must be used repeatedly until the very last man cannot help but know the meaning instantly." Andrew Carnegie, the great entrepreneur, the great steel man, says something like this. He says that our marketing efforts should render it impossible for an intelligent man to be ignorant of the advances we have made in the field of steel production. Okay? You need to repeat your few central points and repeat them again and again until the very last man cannot help but know the meaning instantly. Repetition is crucial. Another quote from Hitler about this, quote, "Propaganda must limit itself to saying a very little, but saying it a lot. First and foremost, that is the absolute important prerequisite for success." And then the last point is that everything should be focused on touching the emotions of your audience. Hitler writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "The less science is involved and the more emotions are involved, the more complete success will be. Success is the best proof of the effectiveness of propaganda and not the fact that it satisfies a few scholars or image-conscious sickly apes who are concerned more with appearances than feelings. Understanding the emotional patterns of the great masses and using proper psychology to get their attention and touch their hearts is the true art of propaganda." This is one of the reasons that he thought speaking was so much more effective than writing for moving the masses. Because when you're speaking, you can look at the faces of the people that you are addressing and judge their reaction to what you're saying and adjust accordingly. You can make sure that you're connecting emotionally with them, which you never quite know if you're doing when you're writing. All right, so he uses all these tactics incredibly effectively. And how does he figure this out so fast? How does he become so gifted so quickly? It defies reason. Is he really just such a gifted orator? That he's just got this unbelievable ability, or has he learned it somehow? And I think actually he had been practicing his entire life. He writes in Mein Kampf about his childhood, quote, "Even then, my gift for speaking was developing more or less through violent disputes with my playmates. I had somehow become a little ringleader among my group." All right, so in many different ways, he is actually practicing speaking from a very young age. And that's what enables him to be so effective when he finally starts getting big stages. And then finally, the marketing. Hitler was a genius marketer. One thing he understood is the old adage that any press is good press. One must be controversial and court attention. So for example, they painted their posters announcing new rallies red. Why is that important, that their posters are red? Reading now from Mein Kampf, quote, "The red color of our posters alone attracted people into our meeting halls. The ordinary privileged class was quite horrified to see us using the red of the Bolsheviks and regarded it as a very curious scandal. The spirits among German nationalists kept whispering to one another their suspicion that basically we were only a variation of Marxism. Maybe even Marxists are some kind of socialists in disguise. These brains have still not grasped the difference between socialism and Marxism. When they discovered that we omitted the standard greeting, ladies and gentlemen, and instead used comrades, and that among ourselves we spoke only of party comrades, many saw this as a proof of the Marxist ghost. How often we shook with laughter at these simple-minded, scared, privileged class rabbits with their clever guesswork about our origin, our intentions, and our aim." All right, so they are intentionally stoking suspicion that they might actually be a Marxist group to court controversy and get attention. They do the same thing with the leaflets they pass out. Quote, "We circulated the leaflets with great urgency and then waited patiently for results. For a color, we deliberately chose red. It is the most inflammatory and was bound to provoke and enrage our enemies the most, thus making them aware of us in one way or another." All right, I love that phrase, thus making them aware of us in one way or another. And as we saw, leftists, Marxists, socialists showing up to National Socialist rallies and making a ruckus, starting a debate, is part of what made them so exciting and part of what made them come. So they're using red posters, red handouts and flyers as a way to say like, hey, socialists, we're on your turf. What are you going to do about it? They're courting this controversy, which is giving them a bigger profile, okay? Manipulating your enemies into discussing you and making noise about you is a brilliant tactic. And what better way than stealing their messaging and their iconography? One more quote from Hitler about this. Quote, "Whether they represent us as clowns or criminals, the main thing is that they mention us, that they concern themselves with us again and again." Again, one cannot help but notice the similarities with Donald Trump, who of course also built his movement by being a popular public speaker, and who also did not care whether he was represented as a clown or a criminal, so long as he was mentioned again and again. And you can see some of these charts from 2016, when he's trying to break through, of the amount of free airtime he was given by CNN, MSNBC, of course Fox News. But CNN, MSNBC, these are ostensibly his enemies. These are people who don't like him. And they're just giving him free advertising because he's so good at courting controversy and courting their hatred, and they can't help themselves. They just talk about him. And it's been 10 years now. We still can't stop talking about Donald Trump. All right, so that is the Hitler strategy for speaking. It works really well, really quickly. There are only a dozen or so people at the first meeting he attends. By the 7th meeting that he speaks at, Hitler is attracting 400 people. And by February of 1920, so less than a year later, he fills the Hofbrauhaus with over 6,000 people. At this meeting, he unveils the 25-point program for the newly minted NSDAP. So it is now at this point no longer the German Workers' Party. It is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. By the way, Nazi is like a short euphemism for a National Socialist. So it's a little bit like calling the Communist Party commie. That's why I, throughout this series, will not say Nazi very often. Because I was doing an episode on Stalin, I just wouldn't say commie all the time. So, Stalin was in charge of the commie party. It's just, anyways, I'm just trying to be professional, right? That was the language used. The National Socialists never called themselves Nazis. They considered it a slur. They always called themselves National Socialists. All right. So Hitler is so popular that leaders of the National Socialist German Workers' Party ask him to take over as chairman of the party, to lead the party. But he declines multiple times. He wants to focus all of his effort on speaking. He views himself as the drummer of the National Socialist movement. He is the speaker who gets everyone aligned on this is what we believe, this is the direction. But he doesn't want to be the corporal. He doesn't want to be the captain. He doesn't want to be the actual leader. In fact, at this point, that is generally considered to be General Ludendorff, who was a World War I general who was extremely popular with the German people and had far-right views and sympathized with nationalist causes. He's not a member of the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, but he's generally viewed as like kind of favorable to those types of causes. And Hitler thinks that eventually he'll be able to bring in Ludendorff as the actual leader, the manager, the hands-on manager. And in the meantime, he's got other people to do that. It is around this time that Hitler sought an emblem that can compete with the hammer and sickle of the communists. A small-town German dentist came up with the winning entry, a black swastika against a red and white background. The swastika got its name from a word in the Sanskrit language, meaning well-being and good fortune. Swastikas were a common motif across many, many different cultures. It's kind of like the cross, where the cross comes to 100% mean Christianity, but actually you can find crosses all over, right? It's like a pretty simple symbol. And you can find the swastika lots of different places. And it does appear to have had some special resonance with the Proto-Indo-European peoples, the conquerors known as the Aryans or Aryans. And to this day, it is used by a number of Hindus for whom the symbol predates Hitler by millennia, right? So the dentist comes up with the general idea of the flag, but it was actually Hitler himself who came up with the final design. He designed the thickness of the circle and of the swastika, and he's the one who comes up with the idea that the swastika should be diagonal in order to convey motion and action. So it is in 1920 that they adopt the flag that we know as the National Socialist or Nazi flag. So now Hitler's life is one of giving speeches almost every day, sometimes multiple speeches in a single day. During the day, he's still doing his bohemian thing. He's still hanging out in cafes and having political discussions with his closest followers. I mean, again, you hate to compare Hitler and Jesus, but it must be admitted that he is living a very Jesus lifestyle at this point, hanging out with his closest disciples during the day and giving big speeches during the nights. He isn't a wealthy man, but he has no real need of money, and some of his wealthy followers provide him with clothes or food, basic necessities when he needs them. His apartment is very sparsely decorated. It basically had a bed and a bunch of books. Ian Kershaw, in his biography Hubris, writes, quote, "Unlike the other members of the party leadership, he had no other occupation or interest. Politics consumed practically his entire existence." And I think that is also crucial to understanding why he was successful in rising to power. That level of focus. Politics consumed practically his entire existence. He's making more and more connections behind the scenes with wealthy businessmen, with politicians, with writers and icons of culture. Hitler is an intriguing man, one in high demand, in part because he's actually sort of secretive. He refused to allow himself to be photographed at this point and kept his private life very private. From early on, the NSDAP creates something called the SA, which stands for, bear with me here, the Sturmbettlung. It means storm division, okay? Or stormtroopers. Far-left socialists were constantly trying to break up far-right nationalist meetings and rallies, and they tried to do this to the NSDAP as well. So they organized basically a group of bouncers to help keep peace at the meetings. In 1921, Hitler redefined the group as a gymnastic and sports division of the party and encouraged the young men to take up boxing and jiu-jitsu. He specifically avoided making it a paramilitary group, though obviously it would eventually kind of shift in that direction. So this SA, this Storm Division, is eventually put under the direction of a former army captain named Ernst Röhm. Now, as I said, up until now, Hitler has resisted the call to take over the party. However, in June of 1921, that would change. Other party officials had been in talks to merge the NSDAP with another political party. Hitler was furious. He writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "It is a huge mistake to believe that the strength of a movement can be increased by uniting with another similar movement. Growth by merger means an immediate increase in numbers, which appears to outside observers the organization has increased in power and resources. In truth, the organization has simply absorbed germs, which will be a source of inner weakness and will cause suffering later on. True joining only occurs when the stronger gains victory over the weaker. The greatness of a movement is only guaranteed by the unhampered development of its inner strength, the protection of that strength, and the constant increase of that strength until it achieves final victory over all rivals. More than that, we may say that a movement's strength and its right to exist increases only when it recognizes that adherence to the principle that struggle is necessary for growth, and that it will only reach the peak of its strength when complete victory is finally achieved. The movement can never attempt to accomplish this victory through instant or short-term gains, but only through perseverance and absolute intolerance of any opposition. Only this way will the movement enjoy a long stretch of growth. Okay, so Hitler threatens to resign over this merger. And if he resigned, that basically spells the end of the NSDAP, of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. They are completely reliant on Hitler at this point as a speaker for their popularity. So he threatens to resign. He basically says, I'll stay with the party on the condition that we kill this merger and that I am made the head of the party with dictatorial powers. He says, we are an anti-parliamentary party. They don't believe in parliamentary democracy. So why do we believe in a parliamentary structure for our party? It's basically functioning like a democracy. We've got all these committees and these committees vote. And we've got a board and all this stuff. And he says, no, we believe in top-down control. So that's what it's going to be. If I'm going to stay on and I'm not going to resign, we're going to kill this merger. I'm going to be the head and no more democracy. Hitler is totally in charge. No more voting committees, only the occasional working committee for people to help get stuff done. And me as the head of the party with total control. This is hard for a lot of people at the party to swallow, but they need Hitler so badly that they relent. Okay, so that is the next major change for Hitler, is that he becomes the actual head of the National Socialist Party in Germany. And he still mostly is speaking. He doesn't do a lot of actual hands-on governance in terms of party governance, but it is a big change that instead of just being a speaker, he is in charge of the NSDAP. Over the coming year, the SA, remember that is the Storm Division, the kind of bouncers that are becoming more of a paramilitary force. The SA becomes more and more thuggish. And in fact, in 1921, they get so out of control that Hitler is actually prosecuted and is sentenced to 3 months in jail, though he only ends up serving 1 month of his sentence. And that is for his encouraging of violence amongst the SA against competitors and against other parties. Now, the NSDAP really shifts, and Hitler takes on a big shift in terms of strategy and focus in October of 1921. And that is because on October 28th, 1921, Mussolini finishes his famous March on Rome with his black shirts. Mussolini, if you don't know anything about that history, is basically Italy's Hitler. He basically creates the movement of fascism in Italy. And yeah, he has this big dramatic march on Rome and gets there, and the president invites him in, asks him to form a government. There's much more propaganda than truth in the idea that he seizes power. They march on Rome, it is true, with 20,000 poorly armed and ill-equipped fascists, but they don't actually physically or militarily take power. They try and create this impression of vitality. But the truth is, King Victor Emmanuel III, that is the king of Italy, invites Mussolini to form a government. So it is actually a legal seizure of power, but it gains a reputation as a militaristic or a paramilitary seizure of power. And this episode gives Hitler the idea that he could do something similar, that he could have a heroic march and seizure of power. A week later, Hermann Esser proclaimed at the Hofbrauhaus, quote, "Germany's Mussolini is called Adolf Hitler." So people are already starting to make this comparison. And this marked a moment in which his followers began to develop this idea of the Führer, the leader, and that Germany doesn't need a parliament, doesn't need a elected body, but needs a leader, a Führer, to be powerful and to push them in the right direction. So Hitler is increasingly popular. The party is growing extremely quickly. Remember, Hitler is member 55 when he joins in September of 1919. By the start of 1923, that number would grow to 20,000. And in 1923, over 35,000 people would join the party to bring the total to 50,000 members. This is overwhelmingly focused in Bavaria in southern Germany, but the party is starting to make some inroads in other parts of Germany as well. The popularity of the far right in general and the NSDAP specifically is greatly increased by a series of crises. One is the monetary crisis. Due to the harsh conditions of the peace imposed on Germany by the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I, the Germans have a major inflation crisis. Okay, so the Germans, they lose World War I, and the Allies, that is Great Britain, France, and the United States, impose this treaty on them that requires them to pay a ton of money reparations. They also lose a bunch of land, and then they cannot rearm. And so their military is greatly reduced in size, and they're not allowed to rebuild up. What happens is that Germany falls way behind. They're technically in default of their reparation payments, not because they're dragging their feet, but just because they're in such a deep financial crisis that they just don't have enough cash to keep their economy growing and be paying France and England all this money. So they're in default on their debt payments. This in and of itself is a crisis. And then the French army occupies the Ruhr Valley, the primary industrial engine of Germany, and takes direct control of industrial output in order to seize it for repayment of on these reparations. This in and of itself is a crisis, but then the government orders a worker strike, the German government orders a worker strike in the Ruhr in order to passively resist this occupation. Okay, so again, to lay out what's happening, Germany owes France a bunch of money for losing World War I. They can't make the payments. So France says, all right, we're going to occupy your most productive industrial territory so that we can just seize the output and basically pay ourselves from your economy. And the German government says, okay, well, we don't think that's right. So we're just going to tell our people in the Ruhr Valley not to work, to go on strike so that you're still not getting any payment. But this goes terribly wrong. So you already have a bad economic crisis and a cash crunch because there's just not enough cash in Germany to keep the economy going and make all these payments. Now you are compounding this problem by shutting down Germany's most productive economic sector. So in the spring and summer of 1923, the German economy goes into total meltdown. Industrial output in the Ruhr Valley collapses. Obviously, government finances disintegrate. And to combat the problem, the government starts printing more and more money. This leads to one of the worst and most famous inflation crises of all time. You've likely heard of this. At its peak in late 1923, prices are increasing by 30,000% per month, okay? People are taking wheelbarrows of cash just to pay for groceries. And this has horrible consequences. Life savings are wiped out in a matter of weeks. Economic activity grinds to a halt. Unemployment, poverty, and accompanying social dysfunction are rampant. Disease, hunger go through the roof. The country is in a real state of crisis, and this has real human impacts. This isn't just like, obviously, like, financial crises are bad in the United States when they happen, but our welfare system is so robust and we're so wealthy that, like, no one really goes hungry now when we have a financial crisis, when we have a big recession. That was not the case back in the 1920s in Germany. Like, people went hungry. People died when the economic situation was that bad. Now, in times of such dysfunction and crisis, the normal way of doing things doesn't seem so attractive anymore. So both the far left and the far right parties are growing in popularity. The NSDAP and other nationalist parties and communist parties are doing well. So on September 26th, Bavaria proclaimed a state of emergency and appointed a guy by the name of Gustav Ritter von Kahr as state commissioner, granting him near dictatorial powers. Kahr and two other leaders who ruled Bavaria sought through negotiations with northern German authorities to install a nationalist dictatorship in Berlin based on a directorate without the inclusion of Hitler and resting on the support of the Reichswehr. That's the name for the German army at the time. Okay, so if you got that, there's a guy, Kahr, in Munich, does want to have a right-wing coup, essentially, and replace the government because things are going so horribly right now in Germany. You got this hyperinflation, people are going hungry. It's just real panic, and they think we need to get people in charge who can affect real change. So this guy Carr is planning a sort of coup, a semi-legal coup, I guess you could say. Is a coup ever semi-legal? Like they're trying to go through channels that, that at least have a fig leaf of legality. Hitler and others in his circle want a directorate in Munich that would then take Berlin by force, kind of on the Mussolini model, right? March on Berlin and forcefully install a government exactly in the way that they want it. Initially, Hitler and his friends try working with Carr and his triumvirate. The triumvirate, by the way, consists of Carr, who is in charge of the government, and then Otto von Lossow, commander of the Bavarian army, and Colonel Hans von Caesar, chief of the Bavarian state police. All right, so those are the three guys. The one in charge of the civilian government, the one in charge of the police, the one in charge of the military. So Hitler wants to work with these three guys. It doesn't work out. Lossow stated that he would only go along with a putsch if the chance of success exceeded 51%, a threshold that he did not think the plan met. He and the other members of the triumvirate wanted to continue to work with the Weimar government, and more than anything, just wait and see what would happen. Hitler was not prepared to wait any longer. He knew, the NSDAP, it had momentum, and he wanted to keep that momentum going. Speaking of Hitler, the biographer R.H.S. Stolfi wrote, quote, "While others were content to apply modest half measures to approach their goal step by step, Adolf disdained half measures and strove for a total solution regardless of when and where it could be realized." And that is certainly true here. Hitler was determined to act and to implement a total solution. However, the putsch could succeed only with the support of the police and the army, right? He's planning to march on Berlin. You're not going to do that with the SA, right? It's just not a real military force. But the negotiations with Carr are not working. And so it doesn't seem like he's going to get it. So Hitler decides that he can't wait any longer and he's going to have to force their hand. And so he's waiting for the right day, and he keeps it very secret. In fact, he doesn't tell a single person. It's only on the day of that he begins to tell the top brass of the NSDAP that today's the day. So on November 8th, Hitler decides we're ready to go. Carr, the state commissioner, was to give a speech in front of 3,000 men in one of the largest beer halls in central Munich. Hitler intended to take over the meeting and coerce Carr to support a coup. Simultaneously, Caesar and Lossow were also to be seized and compelled to give orders for the army and police to support the coup. So the big meeting starts at 8 p.m. in this big beer hall. Again, there's 3,000 attendees, most of them far-right partisans of one stripe or another. Carr is the keynote speaker. He begins speaking shortly after 8. He's about 20 to 30 minutes into his speech when Adolf Hitler, surrounded by an armed guard, bursts into the room. Those near the entrance can glimpse a machine gun that has been set up just outside. The room immediately bursts into pandemonium. Carr tries to make himself heard, so does Hitler. Rumors are flying. People are yelling. At every table in the beer hall, people are asking, what does this mean? What is happening? Are we in danger? What should we do? Should we make a break for it? Who's behind this? Amongst the chaos, no one can be heard and no one can take control. Finally, Hitler stands on top of a table and fires a single shot into the ceiling. The hall quiets immediately. All eyes turn to him. "The national revolution has broken out," he declares. "The Bavarian government is deposed. This hall is surrounded by 600 men. Nobody is allowed to leave." And we will end episode 1 there. On episode 2, we will obviously be talking about the rest of the beer hall putsch and what happens to Hitler's attempt to take over the government. And then we will go through the rest of his rise, the rise of the NSDAP, until he becomes chancellor. We'll go a little bit into his chancellorship. This has been a long episode, actually the longest episode of How to Take Over the World I've ever done. So I'm not going to recap all of my takeaways. However, I will just end with some of Hitler's quotes about how important the skill of rhetoric is, public speaking. He says, "Men are more rarely won over by the written word than they are by the spoken word, and every great movement in the world owes its growth to great speakers, not to great writers. Another quote, every great and world-shaking event has been produced by the spoken word. Third quote, the great masses of a people yield only to the force of speech. All great movements are people's movements. They are volcanic eruptions of human passions set off either by the cruel goddess of desperation or by the torch of the word as it is thrown to the masses. They are not the sweet words of smooth talk, literature, and heroes. Only a storm of hot passion can change the fate of a people. Passion can only be aroused by a man who feels it inside himself. Only the possessor of passion can give the words that will open the gates to a people's heart like a hammer. And Hitler is totally correct about this. It isn't enough to disdain this type of speech and say, well, that's for evil demagogues. That's for people like Hitler. The people will be led by someone. The only question is by who? Will it be you? Will it be us? Or will we leave it to chance? All right, I've got some more things to talk about. If you'd like to hear more right now, I am going to do some end notes on Hitler's first experience with the SA. Then I'll be talking about the Coburg rally and what that meant for the National Socialist movement. I'll also be talking about the first time that the SA has to fight back against superior numbers in the communists, and some more quotes from this early part of Mein Kampf, as well as some more thoughts on Hitler and like what we can learn and what we can't learn from him, and some more anti-lessons from this early time in his life. I'll talk a little bit more about National Socialism and where that phrase comes from and what National Socialism means and whether they really were a right-wing or a left-wing party and what that means. You hear this a lot. Actually, the Nazis were leftists. Okay. We'll talk about that, whether that's true, and a few other things. So if you'd like to hear more and you'd like to support the show, you can go to takeoverpod.supercast.com. And for $7 a month, you can support the podcast. Otherwise, if you are listening at Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe right in-app. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next episode. Until then, thanks for listening to How to Take Over the World. Before we wrap up, one plug for Speechify. All the greats are obsessed with learning as much as possible. They have this incredible thirst for knowledge. And Speechify is a tool that can help you learn more and learn faster. It turns any written content into a podcast, articles, books, textbooks, and even emails. I use it all the time, both for research for this show and for things that I just want to learn more about. If you're a fan of this show, I'm sure you'll love it. So go to speechify.com/Ben and get 15% off Speechify Premium. Again, that is speechify.com/Ben.